climate finance, that is, refers to the resources mobilized from public, private, as well as alternative sources to support mitigation and adaptation initiatives. In studio, I'm joined by Gilbert Musinguzi from the Uganda Debt Network. Many thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Good morning, viewers.
I also have Hilda Tumuhe, a date and aid policy analyst from Seatini. Many thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning, dear viewers.
We're glad to have you both on set. Now, like I said in my preamble, many times climate change tends to offer those that are listening to a debate or a conversation a little bit of a tricky situation. There is a lot of ups and downs. You have to explain how things are interconnected, and for this morning we want to find out climate financing, investment, and the debt burden question. Let me begin with Gilbert Musinguzi, nonetheless, because you are from Uganda Debt Network, so the quick link can be made for us. What is the state of affairs when it comes to the fact that we are experiencing challenges as a result of climate change, but in the process of getting around mitigation and adaptation, we find ourselves increasingly seeking money, and that tops our debt burden to the extent that there are people who are saying we are reaching unsustainability levels.
Yes, thank you. The two are connected, public debt and then the issue of climate change. In that climate change has a lot of effects on the economy, and investment also in climate change, of course, takes resources. The national budget, like currently, if we have 52 trillion Uganda shillings, the big portion of that is on debt. But at the same time, there is need for investment into climate change, either adaptation or restoration of the environment, like that. So the resources that would ideally be committed to addressing issues of climate change, the worse the environment gets, then the more of the resources are drained and diverted to addressing the mitigation, and therefore it also becomes like a gap which is filled by borrowing resources. So that's how they are related. So if we address issues of climate change and there are no disasters, for example, if we have some budget to allocate to Bududa, if there are landslides there, people are to be reallocated, that's when you hear supplementaries coming up, and when supplementaries come, definitely we have to kind of borrow and address the gaps that have been created. So climate change is directly related to the debt burden, and so if we address climate change concerns, then in effect we are also reducing on the money that we would be borrowing. That's the kind of relationship.
Allow me to stay with you briefly before I can come to Hilda Tumuhe. At what point did Uganda begin to deliberately craft policy around climate financing and dealing with mitigation and adaptation?
Climate financing, definitely, even within the MDG period, that's around 2011 or 2010 there, and then when we went to SDGs, for example, SDG 13, I think, SDG 13 is to do with climate change, adaptation, and Uganda being a signatory to the SDGs, it's required to, one, institute policies, and then also do the planning and allocate resources towards climate change, adaptation, and mitigation of climate change effects. So it has been an ongoing process, but it has become even more deliberate. For example, the most recent conference on parties which happened in Dubai.
In Dubai.
So that's
COP28?
Yes, COP28, yes. So it was on, but it's gaining more traction as time moves on.
All right, thank you very much. Now, for Hilda Tumuhe, the national debt has been forecast to continuously increase 2023-2028 by $9.1 billion. That is a staggering sum, even to the average year after the 10th consecutive increase, that is in a year, at 34 billion US dollars. This translates to, is this what the translation to 77 trillion Uganda shillings? And we've been told anytime now we shall be hitting 100. Are we blaming much of that to climate investment projects? Are they taking a lot of money that we have to borrow to that extent?
Okay. Thank you, moderator, and my colleague Gilbert. Borrowing to climate finance, I will not say that borrowing to finance climate projects is entirely accountable or party to the increasing debt burden, because ever since after the HIPIC, that is the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, where we got debt relief, our government has really embarked on borrowing to invest in various kinds of infrastructure projects across the country. Yeah, but when the issue of climate change came up, the reason as to why we could be worried that actually climate change can increase our debt burden, because increasingly we see that climate financing is more skewed to debt and borrowing. Definitely why? Because when you look at our domestic revenue mobilization capacity as a nation, we clearly see that our revenue, domestic revenues are still low, with a tax to GDP of around staggering between 12.5 to 13, yet the recommended for a developing country like Uganda, it would be like about 18% of our GDP. But we still see that this is very low. But also, when you look at the aid coming in, is not actually also in line with the amount of money that we need to expend on the various projects. So partly, climate financing could increase the debt burden in the event that, like any other debt, when you borrow, you need to invest. And actually, when you invest, you expect a return on investment. But if you see the rate at which we've been borrowing and the way we've been utilizing our debt funds, that's where the question comes in. So actually, if we also don't use our climate financing debts very well, it will not yield much. So I'll take an instance. When you look at the current climate financing landscape, you see that government of Uganda in around 2015, I think that was the Paris Agreement, where countries committed to particularly invest some monies and channel it to climate financing for mitigation and adaptation. But also, governments had what they call the NDCs, the National Development Commitments, that they are committing to reducing such and such gigabonds of carbon emissions in a given period of time by probably around 2030 when the SDGs are expiring. So government, when the Ministry of Water did the survey, it analyzed that government of Uganda needs about 2.5 USD million annually investment in climate for the next 15 years to mitigate and adapt to the various changes that have happened to the nation. But continuously we see government is spending less than 18% to actually meet these targets. So when we look at this, it means that either because we cannot collect our own revenues to finance some of these ventures, but also the current climate finance money that is available for developing countries is majorly debt. Even when you look at the UN, when the developed world committed to actually give some money to the developing nations to help them counteract the effects of climate change, we see this has not really come up very well as they continue to lend us, not really giving us grants. So increasingly, this increases our debt burden. Yeah, but also when you look at the issue of climate finance, like any other debt, if we've borrowed for climate financing, it means that all these projects have to go through the public investment management system such that we can actually utilize our debt. This system requires that the debt being borrowed should undergo feasibility analysis. It should look at the cost-benefit analysis before we undertake some of these projects, because climate change is here to stay. But when you look at Auditor General's report of 2020, it shows that that some of these climate finance projects, specifically the one on energy for rural transformation, it had some delays. Yes, but now when it comes to climate finance, these are things that are not going to wait. Yes, if a project is kicked off in 2015 and it's supposed to end in a given period of time, let us implement it in a timely manner such that we can counteract the mitigation but also the adaptation to climate finance. So in a nutshell, that's how climate finance would lead to debt, but also that is how the extent to which if we don't implement these projects well, it would actually lead to a bad debt.
Okay.
Yes.
Why don't we help the layman, who of course includes Chris Higenyi? What is the finance infrastructure right now that the country has embarked on? Something that we can clearly say, because we know that the health ministry, for example, takes this amount of money. How much money is being directed to climate financing at government level, but also from collaboration within the private sector? Maybe this is a question that could have both of you give us a view on exactly where you are from Uganda Debt Network standpoint first.
Okay, thank you. First of all, of course, government has the climate change policy. And with that, it guides on allocation of resources. Okay. And there is a commitment by government to allocate around 10.3 billion Uganda shillings towards climate change. But of that, the actual commitment to the fund is around 850 something.
What do you mean it is a certain other figure, but the actual commitment?
Like in the policy document, it indicates that within the coming period, we are going to commit, say, 10.3 billion. But then the actual commitment towards that becomes much less. So, much as it's less, but at least it's something. There's a recognition that there's need to invest in there. So that way we consider it as some commitment, and though it's not yet enough, but at least we are progressing towards that end.
Okay. Any specific projects the Ugandan can quickly see that are notable, if you're to explain how much money is going into climate financing, especially to mitigation and adaptation, that you can look back, or not necessarily looking back, but be confident when you're told that we are trying to do this and this, and you're like, oh, I think that project is working for us. Any examples?
Yeah, there are quite a number of projects. When you look at government actually instated what they call the Climate Finance Unit under the Ministry of Finance, and on their website they explicitly give a range of projects. I think they are running about 38 projects. 38? Yeah, wow. Yeah, about 38 projects.
They should communicate better.
All these are on their website actually. So, but particularly, like I earlier alluded to, the fact that there is what they call the Energy for Rural Transformation Project. This started around 2001, but it was a three-phased project that was aimed at improving access to electricity in rural areas. Of course, electricity is very vital in the campaign on climate adaptation and mitigation, because when communities have electricity, definitely this replaces with a biomass that is highly used across the nation. And I think this also is a common source of energy around the East African community countries. So some of these projects, yes, it is true that they are actually contributing to climate adaptation and mitigation, but the investment in climate is still not adequate, like my colleague has noted, because we still see a very huge financing gap. Yes, annually we require about 2.5 billion, but we are investing less than 20%. But this is it's not the only case. It's not the case only in Uganda. This is a general problem, country like global-wise. Yes, because we see globally we need about $3 trillion annually to counteract, but we still see we are investing less than $600 billion. So what the World Bank and the IMF have been advocating for, they are telling us that since we don't have the financing as governments, there is a less concessional finance. Why don't we opt for what we call the blended finance, whereby we have the concessional finance coming in, but also with the private sector finance, whereby blended finance you intertwine two. You have the concessional finance, then you also have the private sector finance. So increasingly they're advocating for what they call the private PPPs, the public-private partnerships, as a source of financing for climate. But the issue with this, why we think that it could not be viable, it may not come out so well, especially for developing countries. We see that this has really, PPPs in the past have really not worked well for us as developing nations. For Uganda, we have the famous Lubowa project, whereby we see the private sector coming together with the government to provide some of these social services, and we see that, of course, the private sector is profit driven, and what the World Bank is telling us, de-risk private finance to attract these investments and all this. But in the course of de-risking, government ends up paying more interest.
That's right.
That there are risks associated, and the private sector tends to slap most of these risks on the part of government. So we find that by the end of the tenure of the project, when government is coming to take over the project, it's beyond normal. Like there are many issues to like repair, something like that. So for instance, if it is the toll road, by the end of 20 years when the private sector has run this investment, government still has to make a lot of investment to earn profits out of this. So when it comes to blended finance for climate financing, our position is still very clear. If it is a private sector coming to invest in climate, let the process be as transparent as possible, and all parties should be given chance to do their role. Whether it is Parliament, are they going to supervise these projects? Yesterday we saw, the other week we saw what happened to Parliament when they are trying to go to Lubowa and all that. So imagine Lubowa is a climate financing project, yes, whereby we are trying to counteract the effects of climate finance, climate change. And climate change is not waiting. So if we have projects that are dragging over year in, year out, because of probably the transparency issues, poor public investment management, this will surely affect us as a nation.
Yesterday I read in the papers about a new set of guidelines that will see government not offering guarantees for private sector players who are seeking huge amounts of money. And this, of course, is also bound to affect those that are making huge investments in climate financing. I don't know where this will take us as a country, but I hope there is a solution that can be found, because at the end of the day, there are projects that government cannot undertake, the private sector can't take, because each has their own reasons, and the only option is a PPP. Now, if there are modalities that, again, making PPPs hard to undertake, it leaves us in a situation where, well, the average Ugandan will suffer.
Yeah, well, you're talking about a public debt management framework, whereby government explicitly noted that they will not. Yes, I think it is a good move.
It's a good one.
Yes, why? Okay. Increasingly, we see some of these, they call them guarantees, whereby government comes to be as security, like in case Hilda fails to pay. It
provides letters of comfort.
Yes, in case Hilda fails to pay, I as government of Uganda, this is going to increase our debt portfolio. In the event the private sector does not do its part. And increasingly we have about 10 to 12 guarantees currently running with the Uganda Development Bank, then the IUIU, Islamic something. Yes. But in the event that some of it, because when you see during COVID, I remember in one of the debt reports, report on public debt grants, guarantors, and other financial liabilities, I think the one of financial 2020-23, there was a note that during the COVID period, IUIU had not fulfilled some of its commitment.
Okay.
Yes. So, of course, now, automatically, in the event they default, this becomes a contingent liability on the part of government. So, a measure in the public debt management framework over the next 5 years, to actually stop such commitments by government, it would be a good move. Because when you look at our current debt portfolio, these are some of the things that are threatening our debt sustainability as a nation.
Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Musinguzi, has the Uganda Debt Network had input on this debt management framework?
We definitely usually give input debt management framework, and one, of course, we analyze the kind of monies that either are allocated towards debt, or in some instances we indicate possible alternatives to, like, do domestic resource mobilization, so that if we mobilize more resources, then we also get leverage on the inability, like, to borrow more. So if we borrow less, the less we borrow, the better. And so when we are giving proposals regarding some debt management, and then in that case we are saying you will borrow less. If you reduce on this and we increase this, then we are also in effect reducing on the debt issue. But now on environment, the other element that we are talking, when she was talking, she reminded me of these institutions which we have been investing in. We have about 3 institutions: Ministry of Water and Environment, Uganda Wildlife Authority, NEMA itself. Those institutions, basically, they are almost all in the area of investment in issues of climate change. And because we allocate a lot of resources there, we do what? We have a specific budget in that area, and definitely these are very key in climate change mitigation. But I hasten to add the issue of their effectiveness. For example, one positive aspect that I have seen in NFA, which she was talking about of PPP, NFA of recent, because of inability to raise enough funds to address its mandate, it brought in members of the community, and it allocated some people some land and said, could you plant trees in this area? There are many areas where NFA has given individuals or entities to plant trees. But beyond that, beyond allocation, there should also be the issue of monitoring, so that they monitor you and ensure that you actually implement what you did. In some instances, you'll find someone who has allocated land to plant trees. You end up planting things doing things that are not necessarily the right ones. Like either you build some structures, and yet this is supposed to be a forested area. So beyond that commitment, there should be something in terms of monitoring to ensure that there is compliance. Then the other quick element is that every other project, including the ones that are listed and those that are not listed, as long as there is, for example, foreign direct investment or any project, there is the clause that requires one to indicate to have such this other, it's called what? Environmental impact, social and environmental impact assessment report, where they do establish to what extent are these EAs, whether to what extent are they fulfilled. But the practice has been just a formality, so that every project, there is an organization there are some organizations which actually have just a template of writing an environmental impact assessments report. You go to him, they write, they just fill in, you go and
meaning no one is actually reading those reports to understand whether. And
of course also the issue of involving the public in discussion. Rarely do they really publicize these projects. You find the project has already taken off without community participating. So the requirement that there is an EAS report, environmental impact assessment report, and also the compliance later after the project has happened, that one is a step in the in the right direction, but only that there is the issue of not following up. They commit that we are going to mitigate these effects, but then they don't follow up in that area. But at least that requirement is there. So there is also a need for even as civil society or any other players within the environment sector to carry out a research and see out of the so many projects that we have implemented, how many are really fulfilling, get the report that they made, and then follow up and see the compliance aspect. And in most cases, they are not doing that.
Okay, one thing that I think we all agree on, whether you are in the Philippines or Hawaii or in Norway and Cape Town in South Africa, is that climate change is the existential threat that the world is facing today. So any form of investment that goes into it must be seen to be right intervention. You cannot be seen to question climate financing and investments. But we are lucky that for the last 2 days we have with us in the country Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is the director at the Center for Sustainable Development and the United Nations. And he was very categorical. He was like, you want to reduce borrowing and then do what? And then fall into crisis because you are unable to embark on a critical investment that is bound to ensure that in the future, 40 years from now, you are in a good place. Is it okay to borrow or continue borrowing at the rate we are borrowing, or is it bad to put a halt to borrowing? It's pretty much like the same question, but you need to look at it within the context that he says it.
We agree with him to some extent, but then we also contextualize it. One, definitely we agree with debt for development. Debt for development, yeah. Debt for development, it's everybody agrees, because without borrowing you are not able to meet the budget that you have committed yourself to implement. But there have been a number of challenges that we have always noted. One, preparedness. You have borrowed money, and this money requires, for example, counterpart funding. You are not prepared with that money, then they give you the money, the interest is accumulating, and by the time even you haven't even launched the project. If you have borrowed it, say for 10 years, 5 years down the road, you haven't started. One, you have not compensated the project affected persons, and yet the thing is going on. You have not put in the mitigation measures, issues of gender, issues of mainstreaming, which the donors sometimes require, especially if these are they are the non-concessional loan types. So they will require you to comply with environment, comply with gender, affected persons, and all that, and you have not fulfilled those expectations. So in that case, sometimes some of the donors again do some halting. So our debt management process, we are not as prudent as we ought to be. And then there is the issue, of course, of corruption in that area, that sometimes some of the projects, when the procurement procedures, you find that they have a lot of gaps. And then there are instances when you are trying to borrow and you are borrowing money which you don't necessarily need. So there must be, we must borrow, yes, but we must borrow when it must be necessary, and before we borrow we must be prepared, and we do the appropriate burning in the stipulated time, and we fulfill the expectations of those loans. All
right. I'm afraid we're going to have to end it here. I have a little bit of concern that we need to discuss something on the ground. But Hilda, if you can wrap this up for us with regard to Jeffrey Sachs's comments very quickly, and then we go to Priscilla Regina Naloga on the ground. Okay.
On the comment of, I actually saw the comment when he was encouraging government to borrow for any essential projects that are in the budget that would accelerate development in the long run.
That's right.
Which is very okay. We as civil society, we are not against borrowing, as we've always alluded to the fact that since our revenue base is low, definitely government is not going to impose taxes that are going to harm the businesses, which we are also against. So borrowing becomes the most efficient and prudent means of financing that we have at the moment. But the question is, what type of debt are we borrowing and for what purpose, like my colleague has alluded to. But also what is very crucial in public debt management is what we call the public investment management practices that government is actually undertaking. We have a whole PIMS department, that is a public investment management system department at Ministry of Finance, that is in charge of the feasibility analysis and all these, how many projects are coming into the budget, do we have counterpart funding, have we done the feasibility analysis, but what is most important is the cost benefit analysis. To what extent is this investment going to generate the returns that we have on investment? So with this, but also the oversight bit of the citizens. So as government is investing, we need them to be transparent, avail with citizens with the information, because these projects are in the communities. Citizens monitor, they raise flags where need be, but also then the investments will be viable. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Hilda Tumuhe, Data and Aid Policy Analyst at Seatini. Many thanks to you too, Gilbert Musinguzi from Uganda Debt Network. This conversation cannot be exhausted on Morning at NTV, neither can it be done in a single day. The debate does continue. Climate finance, investment and debt burden is something that should be given the attention that it deserves, not only by the government but also from the private sector standpoint.